Every great investment you've ever made started with the right connections. Connections to the world's most sought-after investment community, dedicated to improving business and society. You are part of this community. Welcome to iConnections Global Alternatives Conference. In 8 short months, managers and allocators who control a combined $60 trillion in assets have used our platform. But as you know, there's more to our story. Funds for Food was the largest capital introduction conference of 2020, facilitating over 3,000 meetings with the industry's most sophisticated investors, while also raising nearly $2 million supporting those in need during the pandemic. We followed this with Fund Women Week, the largest capital introductions conference in 100 Women in Finance's history. Initiatives like these are at the heart of iConnections' mission. In early 2022, we will combine the latest in virtual and in-person participation at the world-famous Fontainebleau Hotel Miami. You are part of this community because you are the people with the vision to improve society. Invest in progress. Welcome to the world of iConnections.
Hello everyone, I'm Ron Biscardi, the CEO of iConnections. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this year's Global Alternatives Conference. This is our first year hosting this event, and of course, it's virtual. But we are looking forward to our first in-person Global Alts event, which will be held at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach during Hedge Fund Week in January 2022. This event will feature world-class content prepared by the iConnections Investment Institute, followed by 2 days of one-on-one capital introduction meetings, which we project will number over 10,000. This event will be free for allocators and open to managers who are members of the iConnections platform. So if you're not already a member, please go to iConnections.io to learn more. Thank you for joining us, and stay safe and healthy.
Hi everyone, my name is Tim Hani and I lead new business development for U.S. hedge fund sales at Bloomberg. With over 167 locations and nearly 20,000 employees across the globe, Bloomberg gives influential decision makers a critical edge by connecting them to a dynamic network of information, people, and ideas. We're excited to be supporting the iConnections Global Alternatives Conference. Getting involved with the iConnections platform through events like this allows us to have a presence and keep our industry in motion in this difficult time. The COVID crisis has not only highlighted the failures of certain governments, but has accelerated a shift in the balance of power from west to east. Today's discussion will dive into this further, and I'm thrilled to be introducing our speakers who are leading this debate, Kishore Mahbubani and John Micklethwait. A Singaporean civil servant, diplomat, and academic, Kishore Mahbubani spent over 30 years at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, serving as Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations. He is currently a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute and National University of Singapore, and has written 8 books about the rise of Asia, geopolitics, and global governance. His latest book is Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to Primacy. Kishore is joined by Bloomberg's own John Micklethwait, editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News. Prior to Bloomberg, John spent over 9 years as the editor-in-chief of The Economist and was awarded a CBE in 2016 for services to journalism and economics. He has written 6 books with Adrian Wooldridge, the political editor of The Economist. Their new book is The Wake-Up Call: Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weakness of the West and How to Fix It. Please welcome John Micklethwait and Kishore Mahbubani.
Hello and welcome to this iConnections and Intelligence Squared event with me, Anne McElvoy. I'm delighted to introduce my 2 guests today. We're going to be discussing perhaps one of the most important issues facing the global economy and geopolitics, China, and has China won in the international race? What the consequences of that might be? Well, we'll be delving into it with John Micklethwait, editor-in-chief at Bloomberg News, a former editor at the Economist newspaper, where I also work. He is co-author with Adrian Wooldridge of a new book, The Wake-Up Call: Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weaknesses of the West and How to Fix It. With John is, hello there, John. And with John is Kishore Mahbubani, Singaporean civil servant of note, diplomat and academic. He's previously served as Singapore's permanent representative to the UN and is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute. And his book is entitled, fittingly for our purposes, Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. Kishore, I'm going to lead you off on that very straightforward question. Has China won, and what has it won?
China is winning. Let me give you, since we're talking to a business audience, let me give one fact. In the year 2009, about 11 years ago, the size of retail goods market in China was $1.8 trillion. In the United States, it was $4 trillion, more than double. 10 years later, in 2019, 3 years after the trade war, where Trump beat up China as badly as he could, the size of the retail goods market in China had gone up from 1.8 trillion to 6 trillion, 3 times. And the United States has only grown from 4 trillion to 5.5 trillion, less than 1.5 times. And if you extrapolate this 10 years from now, there's no question that the market in China will become much bigger because, you hit a sort of tipping point. When the middle class becomes bigger, that middle class suddenly has surplus income, and that's going to drive demand and growth in China and in the region. And increasingly, you'll find that the largest ecosystem of economic growth in the world will in one way or another, especially in East Asia, be centered around China. So unfortunately, the United States, as I say in my book, Has China Won?, has no strategy for dealing with this. And it's time for the United States to wake up and have a strategy to deal with this China.
Thank you very much, Kishore. John, your riposte, China sweeps all before it. The US has no strategy to deal with it. It sounds like game over.
No, I think that's wrong. And I think Kishore's right to say China's having a very good time at the moment. I'm not quite sure I'd say it was winning yet, but it's certainly doing extremely well. And I think COVID has shown it. I mean, if you weren't a big American official later today, and I was just check the numbers. I mean, America is now around 1,300 deaths for every million people. China claims a number of 3. Now, I think we probably all might think China's lying about that, but imagine it's lying by a factor of 10. Well, that would push it up to 30. That would still mean that it's done 50, 60 times better than America. So China's doing extremely well at the moment. I think the 2 sort of caveats to it are, firstly, if you look at the sort of might of Western democracy as a whole, if you put Europe and America together, then I think that by any means is still much stronger than China. I think you can have an argument about whether America is stronger than China. I would probably say it is. And you can have an argument about whether China is stronger than Europe. And I think China may well already be stronger than Europe. But you put the 2 parts of the West together, and certainly once you begin to add in Asian democracies, including places like Singapore, then I think that China does China has not yet won. The second issue is that if you look at the way that tends to happen as places become more democratic, I think that there have to be questions about what exactly happens to China in the future. But Kishore is absolutely right. At the moment, especially I think over the past year, China, from the point of view of the rest of the world, has looked extremely good, especially compared with America.
Well, I'd like to delve into the pandemic a bit more, and then I think we'll turn to the economy and finance. But John, seeing it as you led us in the way of the COVID wars, we'll go there. And then, of course, we have questions at the back end for the last 15 minutes. I'm sure this will come up again. So we're listing questions to both of you as we go along. But how do we think that China has handled COVID-19? Kishore, John was referring there to those numbers and saying even if China wasn't telling the full truth, which has been known to happen, that it was still obviously doing very well in comparison with a lot of leading Western democracies. Is that simply down to the more authoritarian system where things can simply be mandated and people have to go along with it? Or is there more to it?
Well, as you know, Anne, I wrote a piece for the year-end issue of The Economist saying how COVID-19 heralds the arrival of the Asian century. And what COVID-19 has demonstrated, to put it very bluntly, I'm sorry, I'm going to make it, we don't have much time, we'll be very blunt. The competence has shifted from the West to the East. And it's not about China's authoritarian system at all, by no means. At the end of the day, even a government as powerful as Chinese government cannot force 1.4 billion people to do things that they don't want to do. In fact, there is actually a lot of trust in the Chinese government. And as you know, there's been a Harvard Kennedy School peer-reviewed academic study that has just come out that demonstrates the level of trust in China in the Chinese government has gone up. And the reason why that level of trust has gone up is because China actually has gone from what seemed to be a rigid communist party system towards developing one of the most meritocratic governments in the world, where the quality of mind of people in government in China, frankly, among the highest in the world. I think John is more of an expert on meritocracy in government than I am. He's written several books on it. But the competence of the Chinese government in tackling this problem is actually quite amazing. And I think it reflects a larger
brief challenge. I want to throw it over to John. If the Chinese authorities were so confident, both in their meritocracy, but also in the fact that the meritocracy had yielded something that they were able to the scrutiny of the wider world, they would not be as obstructive as they are currently being when it comes to dealing with the World Health Organization, which wants to investigate the origins of the outbreak in Wuhan, and it's coming up against a wall of silence. That does not sound like the response of a confident meritocracy. It sounds like there might be perhaps a lot more to this than meets the eye.
You're asking me?
Yeah, very briefly, and then to John.
Yes, correct. No, well, I would say yes. I mean, the Chinese have been actually very unwise in creating obstacles for the WHO team. I agree with you on that. But I'm actually confident that when the final report comes out on Wuhan, there's no doubt that the Chinese government made mistakes at the very beginning. There's no question at all about that. And frankly, I've talked to my friends. Singapore's medical establishment is very good, by the way, among the best in the world. I think quite amazing. And they say that whenever a new virus emerges, there is a period of confusion because no one is quite sure what the hell is this, because they never encountered it. So the initial confusion, initial missteps is all quite normal, of course. But when the Chinese, I want to emphasize this, when the Chinese government just shut down all of China on the eve of Chinese New Year, that was an amazing thing that they did, okay? Amazing. You could closing down UK just 2 days before Christmas. You can't imagine that. So that was a very powerful signal that something had exploded in China. And so that was the signal. And that one, whether or not there's a WHO team there, no WHO team there, the signal was set to the world.
Okay. I'd like to throw that over to John. I suppose the underlying question, I'd like us to perhaps pivot a bit towards wider themes if we could. And I'm sorry we've had to sort of push this along, but we do want to get to the economic and finance implications. It's just a simple one to you, John, really, as editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, former editor at The Economist. Now the place is a slouch when it comes to trying to get its facts right. How much do you actually trust Chinese data, whether you're talking about the record on the pandemic, as you referenced at the top of the show, or if you're looking at its economy and how it's faring in the global economic race? Should we be more skeptical?
I think you trust the Chinese basically in proportion to how much it matters to them. I would be tougher on them than Kishore on the issue about how the disease started. I think the fact that they are standing in the way of that is, as he points out, really unwise, because China, as I've pointed out, I think we all agree, has had by any normal measure, China has done a much better job at protecting its people than Western countries, and America in particular. But I think you have to sort of bury into parts of that. At the beginning, the problem was not just to do with whether it came out of a particular place in Wuhan or not. It showed also the weakness of authoritarian systems. When people tried to talk about this thing, they were silenced, most obviously that poor doctor who died. So there's very little evidence that pure authoritarianness really helped China. And you look at generally, I think there's a massive danger in people drawing a false positive from this. You look at just because China has done better than America, in general, authoritarian regimes have done pretty lousily. You wouldn't want to be in Russia or any of the Stans or Iran, let alone North Korea. There's just China is the one which has done reasonably well. And I think that it's where Kishore is right is that there is in Asia, and he's written about this a lot, there was a system of government pioneered by Singapore, which believed in doing smaller, more efficient, better government. And Asia has been copying that. Even China has been copying, and that matters. But, most of the countries that have done well at this, with the exception of China, are democracies. Singapore, all the Japan, Taiwan, all the places in Asia, New Zealand, Australia. Again, you go to Europe, there's some countries, Greece, amazingly, has done quite well at this. There's a whole variety of different democracies done quite well. And the fundamental things of dealing with COVID, putting in a testing system, all those things, you don't have to be authoritarian to do this. Just look at South Korea. South Korea is a completely vibrant, chaotic country, much more chaotic than Singapore by many measures. And yet, by any count, Seoul, I think you look at Seoul, London, New York, roughly the same size. New York has lost over 20,000 people. London's somewhere around 10,000. Seoul's lost about 3 or 4, 100, somewhere around there the last time I checked. And Seoul is a place which produced Parasite. It's got some of the world's biggest nightclubs, where I know Kishore is pretty much the whole time. And it's got K-pop. It's got all these things. It's a crazy place. But they introduced testing. They did the sort of simple things. So when the West looks at this, they should certainly learn from one part of the Asian system how you run things more efficiently. But authoritarianism per se, I think, it's obviously it helps in some cases being authoritarian with mass lockdowns, but not and scaring people into staying at home. But it is not the answer. China's the sort of exception rather than the rule when it comes to authoritarian regimes.
I think we should point out for clarity. You mentioned South Korea. Parasite, you did in the movie. Not another sort of horrid creature that we have to sort of worry about. So Kishore, if I could, I think I want to move us on a bit from pandemic handling. I mean, feel free to reference it. But I think that what I'm thinking, listening to both of you, is there's a backdrop to this in which the resilience of countries at a time when the world has been under great uncertainty and turbulence, and populations are naturally enough worried about their futures, which is how strongly do people feel that they can hope in an economic bounce back and that sort of strength, that there's enough elasticity in the system. And on that score, China does pretty well, doesn't it? Its economy grew by 2.3% in 2020, despite most of the rest of the world, or much of it, dipping into recession. What do you think the outlook will be for what do you think the outlook will be for the Chinese economy to continue in this way and even outpace the West?
Well, I'm of course I may be proven wrong. We'll find out 10 years from now.
We'll have you back.
I remain very bullish for the Chinese economy, especially in the recovery after the pandemic. And I just want to introduce a small qualification. When everyone looks at this CCP, they see Chinese Communist Party. Actually, if you want to understand the CCP, it stands for Chinese Civilization Party. And I want to emphasize that because the biggest confusion comes from the word communist. So you think communist, you think, this is going to be like the Soviet Union, it's going to be rigid, doctrinaire, hardline. And actually the Chinese Communist Party or Chinese Civilization Party is not rigid, doctrinaire, hardline. It has the most pragmatic government in the whole world. I mean, let's be very, very clear about that. And so, Deng Xiaoping's method of crossing the river by feeling your way across the stones, the Chinese have shown a capacity to change and adapt and evolve as they move along. And here I can tell you, by the way, the biggest gift that the Chinese government has received is the 4 years of the Trump administration, because when in the 4 years of the Trump administration, Trump basically beat up China as badly as he could. And he actually, in that way, he was a gift to China because he actually woke up the Chinese government to the reality that a real American challenge is coming. And they said, it's time to get serious. And so, the data I gave you about the retail goods market and all that, that's a result of them understanding that they really got to focus on their economic development. It's become the fundamental goal for national security. And that's why they've gone for this dual circulation thing of increasing the internal market and increasing the export market. And if that works, and I think it's going to work, the Chinese economy will do phenomenally well over the next 10 years.
John Micklethwait, let me bring you in there. That's certainly a bullish account. Are you buying shares in China PLC? I mean it figuratively.
Sadly banned from buying shares. No, I agree with a lot of what Kishore says, but I'm just slightly more negative on some things. I think when he pointed out that Trump went for China, he did it in possibly the least efficient way possible. I mean, if you're going to declare effectively a new Cold War, that Trump did, it's like he looked back at the last Cold War and learned nothing. The way in which America and the West win these struggles is by two ways. One is by bringing in allies. If you have a policy of America first, you turn away allies. I mean, look at this. Singapore was a really good example. Look at the way that places that began to distance themselves from America, still American allies, but even allowing for the extra pull of China, this was madness. And the second thing is that Trump didn't sing the song of democracy and freedom or all those things. He made no noises really about that right to the very end. And that, again, I think undermined America's message. It's much better. In the previous Cold War, America sometimes was hypocritical, sometimes said the wrong thing, but in general, it stuck to that script. And it is an angle which gives the West an extra voice, because I agree with everything or a lot of what Kishore said about the strength of the China economy. The basic fact is there's quite a lot of people who would quite like to go to America, would like to work in a sort of freer, better place. There's a lot of hidden strengths. And I think from that perspective, and this is where I think there is a danger for the Chinese economy, is I think with Biden, you might get something which is no less uncompromising than Trump, albeit said in a much nicer way, but far more efficient at standing up to China, something that begins to unite the democracies of the world against China, not necessarily in a sort of vicious way that sounds, but begins to stitch together trade deals, all those sort of things. As I said earlier, you look at that and you reversed it and you looked at it from Beijing's point of view. You just look at the amount of GDP, every single form of power in the democracies of the world. If they do come together, then I think that then the passage begins to change, but only, as Kishore said, brilliantly advocating my book, if the West wakes up. And so we'll wait and see what Biden does. But from a Chinese economy point of view, I think that is an issue.
And from a Chinese economy point of view, Kishore, what do you think Joe Biden will do? At the moment, he can probably, in the early part of his administration, get by on some generalities and perhaps, as John says, a sense that he's rebuilding those alliances in the rest of the world. Talking to Boris Johnson in the UK in one of his early phone calls, he was having those with Western leaders, and I would guess that China comes up along the way. Do you expect, though, there to be really a marked difference in terms of the economic and, we've taken to calling the trade war outlook, than we witnessed under Trump?
Yeah, I want to emphasize that I want the United States to succeed. We want to see a strong United States, confident, leading the world. We don't want the United States to collapse and fail. That's bad for the world. Let me emphasize that. So if I was advising Biden and telling him this is how you make the United States strong again, I would say number one, and this is the key point, is that if you want to really take on the world's most populous country, the world's oldest civilization, first work out a strategy. And the man who said to me that America doesn't have a strategy for dealing with China is Henry Kissinger at a one-on-one lunch I had with him in March 2018, I think. So the first thing the United States should do is to do what George Kennan did and work out a comprehensive long-term strategy for dealing with China. That's step one. Step two is, for now, since you don't have a strategy, at least tactically press the pause button and focus now on fighting the real challenges that the world faces and that America faces. So let's kill COVID-19 first. And frankly, If the United States and China kill COVID-19 first, since China is out of it, actually the United States would benefit more if COVID-19 is killed. And at the same time, that's one of the best-selling books today is Angus Deaton's book, Deaths of Despair, which describes how the white working classes haven't seen their livelihoods improve for over 30 years. If I was advising Joe Biden, I'd say, help these white working classes improve their standard of living, because that's how you kill the Trump base. Because the nightmare we would have is what Martin Wolf warned us about, that the Biden administration may be a pleasant interlude between two Trump or two Trump-like administrations. So let's focus on making America strong. And to make America strong, press the pause button on the US-China geopolitical contest and focus on the real fundamentals, on the things that really matter in America.
Let's talk about the sort of brass tacks of all of this, the world's financial centres and possible shifts after the pandemic. Now, some commentators, I think the Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio, has said he's betting on China emerging as a rival to New York and London. John Micklethwait, you frequent world's great financial centres, or at least you do when you can.
Not much. When
you're allowed out of your bookline study and struggling with your printer like the rest of us. Yeah. I think of you as an urbane globetrotter.
Printer fixer. Yeah.
Would you be? Upvoted.
Ray Dalio is a lot richer than me for many good reasons, but I'm a bit skeptical about parts of that. I mean, obviously, yes. Whenever you have the growth of a great economy, you tend to have a growth of financial centres. I think at this precise moment, it's a bit more awkward. I think the main thing which is happening in financial centres is that if there were 3-4 years ago, you had London, Hong Kong, and New York as the main ones. Both London and Hong Kong have sort of shot themselves in the foot to some extent. And so the main one which has been gaining has been New York. That would be the global thing. I think in terms of the Chinese thing, they've pushed Shanghai very hard. They haven't, and they're now suppressing Hong Kong in various ways, which is not useful. But I think there's quite an element whereby in Asia, yes, Asia will have a financial center of sorts. At the moment, Singapore has been a big winner from that. On the whole, finance does like to go to somewhere where laws are enforced, where you know what's going to happen. And you don't necessarily, if you have a large industrial center, you don't necessarily get a large financial center with it. You get a sort of medium-sized one. Germany, which I know, Anne, you know well, is a good example of that. I mean, Frankfurt is fine. I don't see many signs of Frankfurt replacing London, even despite Brexit. So from that point of view, I think the Chinese are stuck in a rather an awkward situation. They want to promote Shanghai. There's considerable more support in the general sort of finance community for Hong Kong, but the Chinese are unwilling to push that. And so at the moment, if anything, I think Singapore has been the winner from that. So that is, yes, they could make Shanghai into something, but they're going to have to change the way they look at it.
Kishore, as a Singaporean, do you go along with that? And what do you think about that sort of battle with Shanghai? I remember last time I was in China, and Shanghai was determined that it was going to eclipse Singapore as the major financial centre. Was that a fond dream?
Well, I was going to say, you can't see me blushing on Zoom, but I do think that Singapore actually has, to be honest, has been benefiting from the problem. But just a quick point. I agree with John, by the way. Replacing New York as the financial center would be very, very difficult, because there isn't that degree of openness that you find in Shanghai or Beijing or anywhere that can accomplish this. But at the same time, I want to make another warning here that another key part of the financial game is actually much more important, which is how long will the US dollar remain as the global reserve currency? And that, I think, is going to be the question of the day. And for a long time, the Chinese were comfortable and could live with it. But unfortunately, the Trump administration especially has been weaponizing the US dollar, creating massive incentive for people to walk away from it. And therefore, what I do say in my book is that the Chinese might, using blockchain technology, develop a kind of alternate unit of value that will then facilitate China's international trade with the rest of the world. And it bypasses the US dollar. Now, I want to emphasize the international trade section of the role of the US dollar is very small. Most of it is financial transactions. But nonetheless, the international trade portion is very critical. And if the US dollar is no longer used for international trade and people start shifting away, that could become the Achilles heel of the American economy. And so that's another dimension of the financial game that we should also pay attention to and not just focus on financial centers.
And in that case, John, what advice would you give to American businesses, investors looking at China? Is it a stable enough growing economy to invest in? Or, I mean, you've suggested that there might be reasons to be wary, but as I understood them, they were to do with, well, people like to invest where they're clear about the rules that can be changeable in China. But some people might say, well, I can factor that in and it still looks like a good prospect.
Yes. I mean, the answer is you go in there with very clear eyes. Some people have done well in China, others less so. There is still a difficulty with laws on multiple different levels, not least in the media sector, where things are difficult and other people have encountered it. But for all the reasons that Kishore said, and I've said as well, China is a huge market, so people want to be in it. And there is another reason which is sort of gradually emerging, is that if there is conflict between different people, if there is a much less global world, then by definition you're back in the old age of multinationals, where you have to have a sort of foot of each stool in each place. So you need to have something in Europe, you need to have something in America, and you need to have something in China. What's interesting to me in some ways in this is, if you are Biden, at the moment, if we keep on this America first direction, you're going to end up, yes, with a dollar zone, a euro zone, and ultimately some version of renminbi zone. But there is more. You can do some things to stop that. I think by most measures you would expect the Chinese currency to become something that's used more often. It'd be very weird if not. Against that, there's no doubt that China's treatment of some of its neighbors does cause problems in that. I don't think, Singapore again is a good example, Indonesia, India, certainly. There are all these places around it which at the moment are somewhat scared of it. So if the Americans make their currency slight and make their general attitude towards the region better, then that gives them a bit of room. But, I think all of us would agree that in general, the Chinese currency is going to be more used over the next 10 years than it is at the moment. It's just a question of degrees.
Kishore, quick riposte there. If you have one on businesses and investors looking to China, what should they look for and what should they look out for?
Well, I would say, the Chinese government in the last 10 years has made serious mistakes in alienating the American business community. In fact, they lost their number one constituency of support in the United States. And I think I understand that they have finally understood that they made serious mistakes. And now they've changed. There has been a U-turn. And when I talk to the international bankers and other financial sector people, they say that China is laying out the red carpet for them. So as you know, there's full licensing, I think, if I'm not mistaken, JP Morgan Chase, full license for Societe Generale. So they are going out of their way to win back a constituency that they had lost. And this therefore creates a window of opportunity. If you represent a major multinational and you want an entry into China, this is actually now the best moment to go in, because they believe now they got to be nice to you.
Sorry, just cut off quite quickly there. I hope everyone's still hearing me. I'm going to take one last question to sort of wrap up this section. I've got a couple of interesting audience questions pinging in. So maybe we'll just get a take from you both. And it's on this. It's just this whole discussion has reminded me that you can take actions, but we can't always predict the reaction and indeed what works, what doesn't, and what will turn out to have been perhaps less effective than some have thought. When Joe Biden commits to rebuilding US alliances and for perhaps a different tone and approach to China, how sure are we that it will have any effect at all on tempering China's behavior? John?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I mean, it strikes me, and again, there are many people who follow the Chinese leadership. We all do. But there does seem to be something of an argument still going on there between one group of people who are keen to international. They're still keen to plug China into the global system. They think China's gained by that. They think that China's role is China should concentrate on its domestic, fixing its domestic thing and sort of play along with the global system. There is, however, another group within China, both on the one hand who are sort of paranoid on the security side, but also have this, what some people call the kind of wolf pack, these people who see themselves as sort of China's, again, Kishore has written about this, and it's certainly a fact that, China was once the dominant economy in the world, and it thinks, or certainly the leading economy in the world, and that they think that China should head back in that direction. So from that perspective, they think that any kind of signs of reciprocation with the West, just America in particular, there's not much in it. So there is, I think, in all this, I think one shouldn't take for granted that the Chinese sort of mind is going to be made up in a sort of pragmatic, rational way. You look at the way that nationalism is played in China, Japanophobia, many other versions of that, and there is something of an argument going on about that around the Chinese leadership. So no, I don't think that's it's the probability is that we're going to have a broadly pragmatic China, probably one which is more prickly than before, certainly one which is obsessed by national security at home. But that would be the probability. But there are also ones which could be, much more economically self-defeating.
Kishore, I'll take a brief reply from you if I could, because I've got some questions.
I think your question was about what Biden bringing back the allies of the United States. And I think the message he would get from East Asia, even from the close friends of the United States, would be, yes, we want to see a strong United States presence in East Asia. And frankly, why don't you rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership? That was a huge geopolitical gift to the United States to engage in East Asia. But most of the countries would say, please don't force us to choose. Because, we have to live with China. United States may be around in East Asia for 100 years. China will be around for another 1,000 years, So the Chinese have 1,000-year memories too. So don't force countries in this region to choose. And I give you an example, like Indonesia, for example.
Quick one, if you could.
The sheer fact that President Jokowi, he took the Chinese vaccine. That's a very powerful signal.
Let's get into our audience questions now, which I have here. And the first one brings it all down to a point. Do you have any thoughts on the Chinese crackdown on Alibaba and its founder, Jack Ma? John, interested in the signal that sends?
Well, I think he's reappeared suddenly, showing a newfound enthusiasm for rural industry. Well, again, I think this is part of when you're a business and you look at China, I think it matters to two sorts of people. Westerners looking in, who wonder what could happen to different organizations inside China. And I think also from the other point, from the point of view of the many Chinese, and you look at the list of billionaires around the world, which Bloomberg does and other people do, that have been growing rapidly. There is a somewhat Putin-esque reminder that it doesn't matter how high you grow. As long as you're inside China, then you will be subject to these rules and the somewhat capricious nature of them. And if even Jack Ma is subject to that. So I think people will look at that. It may be the Chinese regime may regard it as a necessary piece of sort of hard-headedness to remind everybody who they owe things to. But in general, from the point of view of capitalism, this is the kind of area where you would expect, the West or Biden to point out the advantages of the other sort of capitalism.
Kishore, you could say it's a moment that shows us, and if Jack Ma has reappeared, and when people sort of come back from this kind of absence, they often sort of come back with perhaps a slightly more ideological zeal than they went away with. That politics does trump commerce to a certain extent, and that might also constrain China and its economic outlook.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, if the Chinese put politics first and ignore economics, then it would definitely be a constraint on China's economic growth. It's too early to tell what's happening really with Jack Ma and financial. If the Chinese go all out to kill Jack Ma and to kill Alibaba and kill Ant Financial, they'll be shooting themselves in the foot. What I hear from them is that they stopped Ant Financial, not Alibaba, Ant Financial, because it was growing too big to regulate. And it had become, there were too many stories of corruption here and there and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, the Chinese avoid what is the classic problem in the United States, which is the regulator has been captured by the regulatee. And so China was trying to avoid that problem. And in the case of the United States, basically the structural challenge in the United States is that it has become a plutocracy where the big money decides what is in the interest of the country. Big money influences how much income tax you pay on carried interest and so on and so forth. So I think the Chinese were trying to make sure that big money doesn't have the same influence on China that it does in the United States. That actually China may become more competitive if it can regulate its large financial institutions more effectively than the United States can. But we have to wait and see.
I think it's probably, just to come back on that, I do think there is a big difference. Is that if the Chinese suddenly kind of made Steve Schwarzman and Henry Kravis and whatever, even Ray Dalio disappear, I think people, if the Americans did that, I think people would react in a fairly dramatic way. I think I agree that America has problems with competition, but I don't think anyone solves it by sort of thuggery. I think that is. And that will scare people, but as I said, both inside and outside. But I wouldn't discount the fact that American capitalism's got a number of faults.
So we've talked about China and America as if there wasn't much in between. A little place called Europe from where I'm hosting today. How should Europe balance its relationship with Washington and Beijing? Does Europe need to take sides? And a sort of bit of a bee in my bonnet is Angela Merkel in her late phase, her Spätphase in Germany, seemed to be going rather soft on China for someone who is often a bit of a sort of liberal icon at such gatherings. John, is this balance right from the European perspective?
I think you put your finger on a lot of problems there. I think that several things. One, in a world where you have dueling financial systems, and there is no doubt, America versus China is the big sort of competition at the moment. Well, then, actually, some ways, places we mentioned London earlier. London could do quite well as a sort of neutral place where money can be sort of shared, if I can put it that way. In terms of the Europeans, I think yes, they do need to. There's an initial thing from the sort of US European angle, is that Biden, I think, has to come to some kind of compromise with the Europeans about if they're going to negotiate with China together about what that means, because you've had two very different systems up to now, with the Americans sort of bashing them a lot and the Europeans less. So how exactly, if I was Biden, I would play the long game there and try and bring the Europeans on side. I think the Europeans, both Kishore and I think, will tell you exactly the same thing. If you give a speech in America, and you give a speech in Europe, you give an identical speech. Obviously, Kishore is much better, would never give an identical speech, but some of the rest of us do. If you give the same speech on general global politics or whatever, in Europe, you could get asked about anything at the end of it. In America, pretty much you're guaranteed to get asked about China first. And that's because America is currently number one. And it is feeling the dragon's breath on its shoulder. And that is that's both good and bad. It could force the type of governmental change that we argue for in the wake-up call. It could, on the whole, countries change out of national competition. China has changed out of national competition to some extent. But it's also something that, it means that America has a more aggressive attitude towards China. Europe doesn't. But I do think Europe has to decide to some extent which side it's on. Even if it's more friendly to China, it has to decide which side it's on. And from my perspective, it has to side with the rest of the West.
Another continent I want to mention, so we don't look entirely myopic about the global map. Kishore, how should Europeans, if they can indeed be seen to act at all as one bloc these days, respond to the rise of China?
Well, the simple question Europe's got to ask is, what is the biggest threat to Europe? If it was Russian tanks coming back to Europe, I would say cling on strongly to the United States. But the biggest threat to Europe, by the way, is going to come from the demographic explosion in Africa, which, Africa in 1950 was half the size in terms of population in Europe. Now it's much more than twice bigger. By 2100, there'll be 10 times as many Africans as Europeans by 2100. So it is in Europe's strategic to see the development of Africa as a key priority, number one. And the best partner to do that with is China, because China is the largest investor in Africa today. So what I would say is that Europe has got to maintain its close relations with the United States and also maintain its close economic relations with China, and then try to play a kind of a balancing role. And I think in some ways, what the United States needs today are good friends who can tell the United States how to adopt more intelligent long-term strategies for dealing with the world. And I hope that Europe can become a good advisor to the United States.
Kishore, I'm going to stay with you because third question, which I'm afraid we'll take quite quickly, but it'd be good to have. Are there areas, so I'm so sorry, it's what do you make of China's ambitions in Africa, seeing as you referenced it, which seems sensible to go off the back of what you've just said. Should the West be paying more attention? I suppose if it did, what could it do about it?
Yeah, well, I think the Chinese, actually do have a long-term strategy of making sure that they never rely on anybody in particular, and they're trying to diversify places for exports and places for imports also. And the Chinese discovered, this is it's basically a money issue. They had $3 to $4 trillion, as you know, of reserves, and they discovered even with $3 trillion in reserves, the returns you get on U.S. Treasury bills are very bad. So why not use that money to invest in real places, in real industries, and get a better rate of return, and also enhance your geopolitical influence? So their whole Belt and Road Initiative is a very carefully thought out global strategy intended to benefit the Chinese economy and expand China's geopolitical space. They made lots of mistakes, by the way. They made mistakes, but I think they will learn from the mistakes.
John, China's ambitions in Africa.
Well, they've been there, and it's been an interesting thing. I think on the whole, as Kishore pointed out, they've provided a lot of capital. There has been, there've been more inquiries recently about things that didn't work, and there's been, I think, even you can even talk to Chinese government sources who will say that some of the sort of people who went into Africa were more at the cowboy end of things, and that didn't do their reputation particularly good. The real point again is actually back to from Europe. Europe is the one which is sitting above Africa. It's the one, particularly the Arabic world, but more than that, it's right beside this. And for all the demographic reasons that Kishore's outlined, Europe has got to do something. And it goes back to the kind of point you're making. The Europe fundamentally has got to sort of wake up much more. Is that by any measure, and it's no point in going to the rights and wrongs of Brexit, but by any measure, if you were a normal club and you just lost 20% of your members, or your, arguably at the time, your biggest economy, maybe your second biggest economy, that would normally prompt a lot of soul searching, a lot of strategic thought about what the hell you want to do with Europe. Well, that just is not, that has not been happening. And that goes back to quite a lot to the woman you just mentioned, Angela Merkel, who has managed to keep Europe together, but has she come up with a sort of vision about which way it's done? Has she integrated it? I've drifted off Africa as a subject, but it's symptomatic in the end. And I think that's very, very important.
Last question to you both. Are there areas where China and America could work together? Perhaps we've emphasized some reasonably enough some of the tensions, strains, and risks, but climate change is obviously very big on the Biden agenda. I'm told it's about one of the top subjects he comes to in calls now with other leaders in his early calls of the presidency after the pandemic. He really does show that he's moving it fast up the agenda. So is there an opportunity here? Kishore?
Well, I think climate change definitely, it's very clear that if China is not part of the solution, China becomes a very large part of the problem of climate change. Fortunately, China with this concept of ecological civilization is ready to work with Biden on climate change. But there are other areas. If Joe Biden wants to erode the Trump base in the Midwest, he should open up markets for farmers, American farmers in China. And China actually wants to buy more agricultural products from the United States. And the second area, frankly, is infrastructure. And if there's one country that really desperately needs new infrastructure, if you go on Amtrak or you go to John F. Kennedy, it's the United States. And frankly, when it comes to infrastructure, the Chinese you can imagine win-win deals with each other. So it is possible for them to work together in some areas where important thing is that both sides benefit.
John, would you be so optimistic?
Yeah, no, I think there's quite a lot there. I think climate change is a no-brainer. Really, you suddenly have a US president who's interested in this again. You have China. China is, as Kishore says, it's impossible to do climate really without China. Although India is also very important, and America is very important. So this is a natural zone to get things working. And I think that that COVID again, if the Chinese could overcome some of their difficulties about describing where the disease actually came from, which would be a public service to the world. I think these are things where it could and should work. So if you're Biden, I think you take a sort of two-track approach. You look for these areas of common interest. That would be the kind of Kissingerian thing to do. But at the same token, you begin to build the alliances which have been shredded. You want. In some ways, the horrific thing from the Asian point of view, the Asian democracies Kishore pointed out, is over the past 4 years, what used to be a kind of choice about how you dealt between China and America hasn't been a choice, because America's been absent from that debate other than as a kind of economic power. So start to rebuild things, blend together economics and diplomacy, use trade as a so that point of view perhaps be a little bit more aggressive. But there are these massive areas of, there are global problems we need to deal with. And, the two most powerful countries in the world should be able to work together.
Thank you very much, John. And that is where we must leave it for today. Certainly, you've both reminded me that we started with the question of, has China won? But that a race like this is not really just between two contenders. It has massive impacts on all others as we try to make our way in this uncertain world. And whether it's in trade, economics, or geopolitics, we have an unsettled but absolutely fascinating period ahead of us. Hopefully when we meet in person and not only on Zooms when we get out of the COVID era. Thanks also to the audience for those great questions there. Kishore, I see you've got your home marketing campaign absolutely bang on. Your book is Has China Won? We can see it prominently on the shelf behind you. And John Micklethwait, you're a tad more modest, but your book is The Wake Up.
Less efficient.
Or possibly, I nearly said that, but I thought, let the guy off. Your book anyway, which is very good. And I certainly recommend both of these, is The Wake Up Call, Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weaknesses of the West. Thank you both for joining us, and to our audience, it's been lovely having you with us. Goodbye.